Hello everyone. Today we will be starting chapter 2, that is the kings and kingdoms. Chapter 2 of our past 2 discusses the emergence of new kings and kingdoms between the 7th and 12th century. It highlights how various regions such as the Kaveri Delta became center of large kingdoms. This chapter examines the rise of the Rajput, Rashtrakutas, Palas, and Cholas, emphasizing their administration, taxation, and military strategies. It also explains the importance of temple, irrigation works, and land grants in sustaining these kingdoms. Now, first section is emergence of new dynasties. This passage provides an overview of the emergence of new dynasties and the shifting political landscape in the Indian subcontinent during the 7th century, particularly highlighting the rise of the local chiefs and warriors who gained power and eventually asserted independence from their overlords. These Samantas were initially subordinate to the kings of the time, but played an important role in the political and military structure. As these Samantas gained wealth and influence, they started asserting more power. They began declaring themselves with higher titles, such as Mahasamantas, that is, Great Lord, or Mahamandaleshwara, that is, Great Lord of a region. These reflect a shift in power dynamics, with regional ruler challenging the central authority. Rashtrakutas, a significant dynasty that initially served as subordinate to the Chalukyas of Karnataka. However, in the mid-8th century, Dantidurg, a Rashtrakuta chief, overthrew his Chalukya land overlord and declared his independence. Dantidurg's action represents the broader trend of powerful Samantas breaking away from their overlords and establishing their own kingdoms. To legitimize his rise, Dantidurg performed the Hirangarbhaya ritual. This was believed to symbolize the rebirth of the sacrificer as a Kshatriya, even if they were not of Kshatriya birth. The ritual helped the new ruler claim the right to rule, signifying the evolving role of Brahmanical rituals in political legitimacy during this period. We also learn about the rise of military rulers from non-royal backgrounds. For example, Mayura Sharman of the Kadamba dynasty. Kadamba Mayura Sharman. And the Harichandra of the Gurjar Patihara dynasty were both Brahmins who gave up their priestly duties to take up arms. This demonstrates a shift where individuals from traditionally non-military background used their military prowess to establish new kingdoms. Mayura Sharman and Harichandra actions reflect a broader trend of military leaders emerging in regions like Karnataka and Rajasthan, carving out kingdoms through conquest and political maneuvering. Now, emergence of new dynasties in the 7th century marked a crucial phase in the medieval history of India. It highlights the transition from centralized kingdom to the rise of regional powers and the formation of independent dynasties. The next is administration in the kingdoms. The administration of kingdoms during early medieval India was characterized by a combination of centralized authority and shared power, while kings adopted grand titles like Maharaja Dhiraj, like great kings, overlord of the kings, and the Tribhuvana Chakravartin, meaning lord of the three world, to project their supremacy. Their actual control was often limited. They had to share power with the Samantas. Samantas were feudatories, as well as local association of peasants, traders, and Brahmins. So, how the revenue was collected and utilized? The primary source of revenue for these kingdoms came from the producers, including peasants, cattle keepers, and artisans who were either persuaded or forced to surrender part of their produce. Traders who were taxed to generate additional incomes, landowners who claimed rent from cultivators. The collected revenue was utilized for various purposes, like maintaining the king's establishment, which included the royal court, officials, and military expenses, construction of temple and forts, serving both religious and strategic purpose. Now, wars and expansion to acquire wealth through plunder, gain control over new lands, and secure trade routes. Now, who were administrative, official, and military? Now, revenue collection was primarily handled by officials recruited from influential families, ensuring loyalty to the king. These positions, including military ranks, were often hereditary. Many close relatives of the king held key administrative and military roles to maintain control over governance. Thus, while kings presented themselves as supreme rulers, their administration functioned through a network of local power holders and influential families who played a crucial role in governance and revenue collection. Now let's understand this section 400 taxes. In modern times, taxation systems are far more structured and standardized compared to the Chola period. While we no longer have hundreds of different taxes like those mentioned in Chola inscription, some forms of taxation still exist in different ways. Here is how. Now, land revenue, which was called Kadamai, in the Chola period, Kadamai was a tax on land. Today, property tax is collected by local municipal bodies from landowners, similar to Kadamai. Now, forced labor, that was called Vitti. Vitti was a form of tax where people were forced to work instead of paying in cash. Today, forced labor is illegal under the Indian Constitution, but some remnants of this practice existed historically in forms like Bekar, which was unpaid labor for landlords. Now, taxes on specific activity like the Cholas tax, things like thatching houses and using ladders to climb palm trees. Today, we have service tax, GST, and excise duty, which are levied on specific goods and services. For example, property registration tax, similar to tax on succession to family property, professional tax, tax on certain profession, similar to occupational taxes in medieval times, road tax and tolls, charges for using roads, comparable to old taxes on using certain resources. Now, what are the key differences? Modern taxes are standardized and regulated, where Chola period taxes varied greatly and were often arbitrary. Taxation today is based on law and policies rather than the discretionary power of rulers. Forced labor is outlawed, unlike in the Chola period. Thus, while the nature of the taxation has evolved, the fundamental idea of the collecting revenue from the public for governance and development remains the same. Now, the next section is Prashasti and land grants. Prashastis were praise poetry written to glorify the achievement of rulers. These were typically composed by learned Brahmins who were well versed in Sanskrit and had a strong connection with the ruling elites. Their purpose was not just to record history, but to present a positive image of the king and his reign. Prashastis were often idealized and exaggerated account of a king's reign. They depicted rulers as valiant warriors, victorious conquerors, and benevolent rulers, even if the events described might not have been entirely true or accurate. This was done to glorify the king and solidify his legitimacy, authority, and divine favor in the eyes of his subjects. While they may not be factually reliable in the strict sense, Prashasti were significant in understanding the self-representation of rulers and the political narrative they wished to convey. For historians and scholars, these sources provide insight into the ideas and values that rulers wanted to project during this period. Now, the Brahmanas who composed these Prashastis were highly involved in the administration of the kingdom. They were often given land as reward for their service to the king, especially for their literary or religious contribution. By rewarding Brahmanas with the land grants, the king ensured their loyalty and also strengthened the relationship between the ruling elite and the religious scholars. The land grants given to Brahmanas were recorded on a copper plate. These copper plate inscriptions were a formal way of documenting the grant, ensuring that both the recipient and the kingdom subject were aware of the transfer of land and its significance. Such land grants were part of the feudal system where kings would assign land to trusted individuals in exchange for their loyalty, military support, or administrative services. Here you can see one such copper plate inscription. Now, this inscription was issued by a ruler in the 9th century, and it is written partly in Sanskrit and partly in Tamil. Now, you can see how the rings holding the plate together is secured, and I think we have royal seal also, meaning this is an authentic document. Here, once Prashasti is mentioned, it is written in praise of the Nagabhat. Now, unlike the Prashastis, which were composed to glorify kings and their achievements, Kalhana, which was an author from the 12th century, took a different approach. He is known for writing the Rashtarangini, a historical account of the kings who ruled over Kashmir. This text is significant for its critical approach to history, contrasting with the typical glorifying tone of Prashastis. Now, Kalhana was critical of the rulers and their policies. This is a significant departure from the usual praise found in Prashasti. Kalhana's historical narrative offered both positive and negative assessment of kings, which provides us with more balanced view of the political and social dynamics of the time. Unlike Prashasti, writers who were often commissioned by the kings themselves to glorify their reign, Kalhana was more independent in his judgment. The Gurjar Pratyahara, Rashtrakuta, and Pala dynasties fought for control over the strategic city of Kannauj in the Ganga Valley, leading to a long-standing conflict known as the tripartite struggle. Rulers often targeted wealthy temples during their military campaign. These temples were rich in resources and symbolized the power of the rulers. The destruction and the plundering of temples were a common tactic to assert their dominance. Now, Mahmud of Ghazni was a prominent invader who raided the subcontinent frequently, targeting wealthy temples like the one at Somnath in Gujarat. The wealth he plundered helped him build a grand capital in Ghazni. He also commissioned Al-Biruni to document the subcontinent's culture and history, resulting in the important book that is Kitab al-Hind. Now, the Chamanas or the Chauhans ruled around Delhi and Ajmer, expanding their territory against rivals like the Chalukyas and Garhwalas. The most famous Chamana rulers, Prithviraj III, defeated Sultan Muhammad Ghori in 1191, but was defeated by him in 1192, marking a significant turning point in Indian history. Now let's look at this question, why these rulers wanted to control the Kannauj and the Ganga Valley. The Ganga Valley, with Kannauj as a focal point, was one of the most prized regions in early medieval northern India. Now, Ganga Valley was among the most fertile and agriculturally productive areas in India. Control over this region meant access to abundant agriculture revenue and resources. Kannauj was located on key North Indian trade routes connecting eastern and western part of the subcontinent. This allowed rulers to control commercial exchanges and collect taxes from traders and merchants passing through the regions. Cities like Kannauj were major urban centers that attracted artisans, merchants, and administrators, making them hubs of wealth and craftsmanship. Now, ruling Kannauj was seen as a mark of imperial legitimacy and supremacy. Dynasties that established control over the city could claim succession to earlier powerful empires, enhancing their prestige. Now, previous Indian empires like Harshas had made Kannauj their capital, bestowing upon it great symbolic importance. Control over Kannauj was associated with a mandate to rule the north. Now, geography of the Ganga Valley offered natural defenses and facilitated rapid troop movement. So, conquering and ruling Kannauj enabled these dynasties to leave a lasting legacy and project their power, aspiring to become overlords of North India. In summary, the struggle for the Ganga Valley and the Kannauj was driven by immense economic wealth, strategic location, political prestige, cultural reputation, and military advantage. Whoever held Kannauj controlled the heartland of North India and could claim dominance over the subcontinent. Now, the next question is why the Chamanas may have wanted to expand their territories. Now, the Chamanas wanted to expand their territories to strengthen their political and military power, secure wealth, defend against rivals, gain prestige, and establish their supremacy in the region. These motivations were characteristic of the era's dynastic rivals across northern India. Cholas. The Cholas. Now, the rise of the Chola dynasty is a significant chapter in medieval South Indian history. The Muttairiyar were a minor chiefly family in the Kaveri Delta who initially held power there. They were, however, subordinate to the Pallava king of Kanchipuram. They were the dominant force in the region at the time. The Cholas had an ancient lineage from the Urayur in the mid-19th century. Vijayalaya, a member of this family, captured the Kaveri Delta from the Muttairiyar and established his rule. He founded the town of Tanjore, marking the start of the Chola dominance in the region. Vijayala's successor continued his expansionist policies. They successfully conquered neighboring territories, including land held by the Pandyas to the south and Pallavas to the north, thereby consolidating and growing the Chola kingdom. Rajaraja I is considered as the most powerful Chola ruler. Ascending the throne in 985, he expanded the Chola empire significantly, bringing large parts of the subcontinent under his control. Rajaraja also reorganized the administration, ensuring great efficiency and centralization of the empire. The son of the Rajaraja, Rajendra I, continued his father's policy and extended Chola influence even further. Rajendra not only raided the Ganga Valley but also invaded Sri Lanka and launched military expedition to Southeast Asia. He even developed a navy to support these overseas campaigns, further establishing the Cholas as a naval power. The Cholas rose to power through military conquest, strategic territorial expansion, and strong administrative reforms under leaders like Vijayalaya, Rajaraja I, and Rajendra I, becoming one of the most powerful dynasties in South India and beyond. Next is splendid temples and bronze sculptures. Now, Thanjavur and Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the temple built by Rajaraja I and the Rajendra I, are celebrated for their architectural grandeur and sculptural beauty. These temples were not just religious centers but also symbols of Chola power and artistic achievements. Now, Chola temples often became the nuclei or central points of settlement, leading to the growth of towns around them. These settlements thrived due to the economic activity generated by the temples. Rulers and other endowed temples with land grants, which were crucial for the economic upkeep of the temple. The produce from these lands were used to maintain the temple's infrastructure and to support the specialists who worked there. These specialists included priests, garland makers, cooks, musicians, and sweepers. This system helped create a self-sustaining economy centered around the temple. Among the various crafts associated with the temples, bronze image making became a distinctive feature of the Chola art. Chola bronze sculptures are considered some of the finest in the world due to their detail, elegance, and expressiveness. Now, these bronze images were mostly of deities, reflecting the religious significance of the temple. However, sometimes images of devotees were also created, highlighting the importance of individual worshipper in the religious and cultural life of the time. And the next is agriculture and irrigation. The Kaveri Delta was central to agricultural development in the Chola period. It branches into several small channels before emptying into the Bay of Bengal, and these channels often overflowed, depositing fertile soil along their banks. This process, known as the silt deposition, enriched the soil and made the region ideal for agriculture, particularly rice cultivation. While agriculture has existed in Tamil Nadu earlier, it was from the 5th or 6th century that the Kaveri Delta was opened up for large-scale cultivation. This required substantial effort to clear forest, level land, and construct embankments to control flooding. Canals were built to channel water to fields, allowing for effective rice farming. The fertile land and well-managed irrigation system allowed for the practice of double cropping, meaning that the two crops were cultivated per year. This was made possible by the efficient use of water from the Kaveri River and the canals that supplied water throughout the year. Irrigation was critical to ensure sufficient water for crops, especially in drier periods. Various methods were used, including wells dug in certain areas, large tanks constructed to collect rainwater. The Chola Empire's agriculture success was built on the effective use of natural resources, especially the Kaveri River, and the construction of complex irrigation systems. This agriculture prosperity enabled the Cholas to support large population, maintain a powerful economy, and contribute to their military and cultural achievement. The collaboration between rulers and the local communities in managing irrigation work was key to the growth of Chola Empire. Now let's look at the administration of a Chola Empire. The Chola administration was well organized with clear structure at different levels. Now, village level administration, the basic unit of Chola administration was the village known as the Ur, where peasants lived and farmed. Several villages came together to form a larger unit called a Nadu. Both the village councils and the Nadu handled important tasks such as settling disputes and collecting taxes from the villagers. Now, what was the role of rich peasants? The rich peasants, especially those from the Vilala caste, had a lot of power in running the Nadu. They made decisions about the local matters, but they still had to report to the central Chola. The Chola kings gave special title to rich landowners to show respect and to give them support, to give them important job in the government. Titles like Muvinda Villain, meaning peasant serving three kings, and the Arayar, meaning chief, helped these landowners manage the empire more effectively. Now, the Brahmans, meaning priests, were often given land called Brahmadeya by the kings. These lands were usually in the Kaveri Valley. Brahmanas settlement formed, and each settlement had an assembly called Sabha made up of Brahmana landowners. The Sabha helped manage the land and made decisions for the local community. In the Uttar Merur, which is in Tamil Nadu, there is a famous inscription that explains how the Sabha worked. They used a random selection system to choose committee members. Names of people eligible to join were written on palm leaf tickets. A young boy would pick up names from a pot, ensuring fairness in the selection process. Traders in towns formed groups called Nagaram. These trade associations also help with some administrative tasks like managing local businesses and trade. Now let's answer this question which is given here. Do you think women participated in this assembly? In your views, are lotteries useful in choosing member of the committee? Now in the Chola period, women's participation in administrative and political activities was quite limited. Most of the administrative roles, including the sabhas, meaning assembly of landholders, and Nadu councils, were dominated by men, especially rich landowners and brahmanas. However, while it is unlikely that women held leadership role in these assemblies, women did have roles in the cultural and religious life of the society, particularly in temples and in managing family estates. Now, lotteries can be useful for ensuring fairness and equality in small committees or community decision, but they might not be the best method for more complex, highly specialized roles where experience and skills are crucial. Now let's read this section, the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty in China had a unique system of bureaucratic governance that was significantly different from the administrative system in the Indian subcontinent during the same period. The Tang Dynasty established a bureaucracy where officials were chosen through an examination system. This examination, often based on Confucian text, was open to all men, regardless of their social or economic status. Those who passed the exam could enter government services, allowing for the possibility of merit-based appointment, rather than appointment based on birth or family connection. In contrast, in much of the Indian subcontinent, rulers and officials were often chosen based on hereditary principle or feudal loyalty. Now, local rulers like Rajput, Cholas, or Guptas often inherited their position, and the high ranking officials were often selected from the elite or landowning classes. In some kingdoms, Brahmanas were given land grants and held important administrative roles. But there was no unified merit based system like China's examination system. The Tang Dynasty examination system for selecting officials was more merit based and centralized than the systems in the Indian subcontinent, which were often based on hereditary or feudal principle. The Chinese system allowed for greater social mobility and more professionalized governance, while India's administrative structures were more decentralized and often tied to caste or family lineage. Now let's start with the exercise. First one is, let's recall, which is match the following. Now Gurjar Pratihar, they belong to the region of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Now Rashtrakutas, they belong mainly from the Western Deccan. Now Palas, they were from Bengal, and the Cholas, as you know, we are left with Tamil Nadu. So it is. Now the next three questions, like the one here, question related to tripartite struggle, and the question related to Chola Empire Sabha committee, and the next is two major cities under the control of Brahmanas. I think they are pretty easy. You should attempt doing this because we have already discussed much enough about this topic. Now the next question is, how did Rashtrakutas become powerful? Now the Rajputa dynasty became powerful through military conquest, strategic alliance, and strong leadership. They controlled key regions in the Deccan Plateau, which gave them access to important trade routes. Their military success, including defeating rivals like the Chalukyas and Pallavas, allowed them to expand their empire. They were also known for efficient administration, religious tolerance, and the patronage of culture, which helped solidify their power. Rulers like Dantidurg, Krishnavan, and the Amogh Varshavan played pivotal role in their rise. Additionally, the decline of the neighboring kingdoms gave the Rashtrakutas an opportunity to dominate central and southern India. Now you should always look at the map where these dynasties were located to give the better answer for these questions. Now the next is, what did the new dynasties do to gain acceptance? Now in ancient India, new dynasties gain acceptance through a combination of military conquest, religious legitimacy, cultural integration, and the effective governance. Now the key strategies included religious legitimacy. Now rulers often claimed divine support or connection to God, as seen with the Mauryas, like Ashoka's adoption of Buddhism, and the Gupta's promotion of Hinduism. Now military conquest, like dynasties like Mauryas and Rajput kingdoms, secured power through conquest, expanding their territories through force. Now next is cultural integration. New rulers embraced local customs and promoted cultural development. such as the Gupta Empire's patronage of art and learning, and the Chola support of Tamil culture and Hindu temples. Now, effective administration, such as the modern bureaucratic system and Gupta's decentralization, ensured social and economic stability. Now, rulers often formed alliance through marriage to strengthen their position, as seen in the Chola dynasty. Now, ensuring economic growth through trade and infrastructure, like the Maurya's development of roads and the Gupta's promotion of commerce, helped maintain popular support. Now, rulers like Ashoka promoted ideals of dharma and religious tolerance, which gained the loyalty to diverse population. Now, overall dynasty that successfully blended military power, religious endorsement, cultural patronage, and effective governance were able to secure long-term acceptance and stability. Now, the next question is, what were the activities associated with the Chola temples? Now, Chola temples were centers of religious, culture, economic, and social life. Now, key activities were religious rituals like daily worships, grand festivals, and processions. Cultural and artistic activities like music, dance, Bharatanatyam, sculpture, and literature. Now, economic activities were also there like temple land management, trade, and craft. Social welfare like charitable activities, food distribution, and education. It also performed administrative function like temple management, legal matters, and royal patronage. Now, it attracted devotees and formed pilgrimage circuits. Now, infrastructure maintenance, renovation, and upkeep of temple structure. Now, these activities help integrate temples into the fabric of Chola dynasty, fostering prosperity and cultural development. Now, in the next video, we will start with the next chapter, which is the Delhi Sultans. Thank you.